Hey everybody, Hooch here, and if you're watching the video, please consider subscribing because according to YouTube, not enough data to show this report. Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. We've got a fun one for us today. It's about how indie games are killing the AAA industry, and I think there's some merit to that. I've been saying for a couple years now that not so much maybe the indie game studios, but modding actually, which is almost sub indie. It's the indie of indies, if you will, has actually been the one leading the charge for new games, new ideas. You think about the true most prevalent game genres in the last 10 years, I would argue are battle royales and MOBAs. MOBAs stemmed from a map creator mode from Warcraft 3, and that was not something that was either developed or even pursued by Blizzard. They fumbled the ball pretty hard on that one. And battle royales, which I actually played the early Arma 2 map. It was an Arma 2, which is a military simulator, and there was a modded game mode that really created and birthed the battle royale genre. So without further ado, we're going to be watching how indie games killed the AAA industry.
How did Halo go from this to this? And how can a game made by one dude in his bedroom have a larger player base than Halo, Call of Duty, and Battlefield combined? To answer these questions, we first need to understand why AAA studios have taken all of their desire to make fun games and just thrown it out the window.
Do you guys not have phones?
From what I found,
that honestly might be the single most memed and remembered thing about gaming and gaming fails in the decade following since it happened. Like, people will still be memeing on that at the end of the 2020s. That's my easy prediction. I don't even think that's much of a I don't think I'm taking a risk by saying that.
Decades back, when the video game industry really became mainstream with the release of Space Invaders. This game took the world by storm and really put video games on the map. See, companies were scrambling to get a piece of the growing video game industry, and the man who kicked everything off was Space Invaders' only developer, Tomohiro Nishikado. See, the thing is, back in the 70s and early 80s, most games were made by one or a few developers.
Yeah.
You couldn't pack much.
Yeah, if you read anything on the history of gaming, which I've definitely read a fair bit myself, back in these times, there was one guy who created literally everything. And I'm not just talking about the game itself, the characters and the models and all this stuff, like the music even. I mean, music at this point was still actually kind of a relatively new thing to be able to do that in games. It was very simplistic, obviously, but still. So you had people that were jack of all trades, and you can't even call them the master of none because they were still kind of the master of what they were doing. It's absolutely astounding when you read. And sure, of course, you couldn't bring those guys into the modern gaming industry and expect them to make a fully, realized 3D world and all the stuff that we have now with all the bells and whistles. But it's genuinely admirable to see people. And I've gotten to get a little bit of taste myself, not to put myself on that level by any means, but having to do video editing, streaming, photoshopping for thumbnails, like all this stuff. It's just like, I have a problem, solve it. I have a problem, figure it out, solve it. And it's both rewarding, but it's also like, you got to tip your hat to these guys who probably weren't composers and realized they could make music. They needed to make music, and they did something. They did something with the available resources that they had.
Into a whopping 4 kilobyte game cartridge after all. So games were simple in design, but because developers couldn't lean on graphics or music to attract a lot of players, games developed at this time really had to be fun. And Tomohiro understood this perfectly. In an interview a few years ago, Tomohiro even had this to say: "Yes, I developed Space Invaders by myself. In those days, that was the standard for games to be made by one person. Today, however, that work in development is so divided and specialized that one person can't really see the whole picture. And in that sense, I think developers need to go back to the beginning."
This is a really interesting point, and I've seen it made a couple different times, but this is one of the more concise ways I've seen it phrased, which is everyone is so siloed. It's kind of more of a modern term, or maybe it's not, but it's the term that we would use. By being siloed, you're inherently unable to see the bigger picture. You're even unable to just know what other people are doing because everyone is in their respective silos. And if you have a really strong manager who has really strong strategic thinking and planning, it can work. So I don't want to say the only way to make this work is to like somehow do some decentralized version of game development. But you have to have somebody who is as passionate as the sort of entry level engineers or developers, because those are the guys who are into the industry. They're fresh into the industry and they have the most heart and soul in some ways, because they are there, especially in gaming. They are there because of their love for it. It's not the highest paid industry. It's certainly not the highest entry level paid industry out there. And they are there because they love it. And they are there because they want to create masterpieces that influence kids and people the way that they were influenced as kids. And it's hard to find an executive with that. We've watched other videos where the executives are seemingly more and more disconnected because they get some executive from some random other company, and gaming industry, or sorry, gaming companies are seemingly relegated to sort of the B and C tier B and C tier executive teams. They get these people from like Pyrex, the cookware, and it's like, okay, like they might have run a successful like bakeware line of dishes or whatever, and they did well over there, but like having someone who's genuinely passionate about it can make a world of difference. They bring more motivation to the table. They actually show up in a way that somebody who isn't passionate doesn't. So I see what he's saying, and I actually do agree more than I disagree. But I think the biggest problem in gaming with execs is that they are completely devoid of passion, and they also, of course, are somewhat handcuffed by the restrictions that the board, by taking public money, they're somewhat restricted in what they can do. But if they cared more, they'd fight the board more, kind of thing. Like if they cared more, they would go against some of these more predatory microtransactions, for example. And they don't, because they don't care.
Beginning. Although Tomohiro doesn't fully explain what he means by beginning, what I interpret his words to mean is to get back to where each team member understands the vision of the game they are working to create. The video game industry wouldn't be the same without Tomohiro, and I believe he's a huge reason why gaming is what it is today. Space Invaders captivated millions around the world, causing people to fall in love with video games and ushering in the golden age of the AAA game. Over the next few years, technology for making games improved drastically, and games became more sophisticated, requiring more people for development. Couldn't just make a game on your own anymore. The industry was maturing.
Yeah, and you got to remember, around the late 90s, early 2000s is when 3D gaming really came into being. And once that happened, there was no real small team projects in a sense. If you think about a lot of the indie games, and you saw some of them like Hollow Knight, that's a 2D game. Yes, it's modern. Yes, it has better lighting and its effects than old games. But if you look at most indie games that are 1 and 2 man or small team, 3 or even 3 people, 4 people, they're generally not going to be 3D if they're going to be full length feature games. So we did sacrifice in some ways the ability to make some games with 3D modeling. Small teams with 3D modeling, but I don't think anyone really wants to go back to only 2D games. So,
and teams needed all sorts of talent and specialization to make games work. Game studios began expanding at an incredible rate to create more advanced games. So as the 80s and 90s progressed, we see less and less solo developers like Tomohiro producing these great games. I wonder if he'll point that out. Bungie is a great example of this. They only had 3 employees in the early 90s.
Yeah, and they were making
together,
Marathon.
The 3 of them went on to create a few successful games.
I mean, they made like Marathon and like kind of, it's like 2D shooters in the same vein as like Doom. So again, it really was when they pushed into 3D that you started needing full-time artists, full-time composers as well, just because some of it is just budget. I wouldn't even call it bloat. It's just growth for bigger productions. But that jump from 2D to 3D can't be understated. And I don't want to belabor it too much, but I don't know if this guy's going to mention it.
Operation Desert Storm, Minotaur the Labyrinth of Crete, and Pathways into Darkness. But they were relatively small and simple. A few more employees were added over the years, and the company grew. Most of the employees were college students with nothing but the desire to make fun games. Probably inspired by developers like Tomohiro. As Chris Butcher put it,
the culture of Bungie is pretty simple. There's a bunch of college kids who wanted to drink beer and eat pizza and like do amazing cool stuff in their basements.
10 years after the launch of Bungie,
they're gamers. I mean, drink beer, soda. I mean, depends on your age or what you like. Eat pizza and do cool shit on computers. It's like they're gamers.
40 people were doing
How many gaming execs do you think sit in their basement, drink beer, eat pizza, and play video games? Like,
just that.
zero?
And from the scrappy team nourished by pizza and beer, Halo was born. Obviously, it exploded in popularity. It felt like Halo was the only reason most people bought an Xbox. Microsoft, of course, loved it. So more money, talent, and resources were just thrown at Bungie to make Halo 2. But even though the team grew in size, the culture was still the same. The Bungie team was passionate about making the best game.
And maybe I should watch a documentary on that shift, because normally an influx of money can actually do more, like a certain amount too much can do more harm than good. There's a term for it in economics for countries that have discovered oil, and we won't go into it deeply, but think of like Venezuela, a country that has so much natural resources in form of oil that they should not be as poor as they are. I think it's like Dutch something disease. I don't know. Sorry. But it's basically a term for having an influx of money and via natural resources can actually do way more harm. And so I was expecting him to say, after Halo 1, Microsoft dumps money on them, and that's when things started to turn. But he's saying that actually they managed to keep a steady hand on the culture wheel. And that is actually really rare. And that requires very strong cultural identity and leadership from the top, as well as all the way to the bottom. But it's got to come from the top, because the new people who come in will look to the execs to set the tone. And even if they don't look at them to set the tone, if the execs don't care about culture, it will 100% come through. And I can give you a brief personal example. Was I worked at a company. There was an actual culture committee that met once a week, and the company was growing so fast that they had a vested interest in trying to keep the culture strong and pervasive throughout the company. And of course, there were good cultural things to have. But I realized about a year, and I attended this every week. I was there, even if I didn't have any ideas. I was there. I wanted to be to know sort of what people were thinking, what they wanted to set. And it dawned on me a couple months in, and then fast forward to like a year later, I never once saw anybody from the executive team, not the CEO, not the CFO, CIO, like any C-suite, this is what it's called. I never saw any of them there. One time, one of them showed up to pitch a charity they were working at, and then they left right after. So it was very clear to me that culture was not as important to those folks. They said it was, because all these guys say that it is. But again, you judge people by their actions, not their words. So in any event, I would be interested, and perhaps on my own time, I would look up and learn a little bit more about Bungie and how they managed to keep a strong, pervasive culture as they probably doubled or tripled their headcount internally.
And man, they did just that. Halo 2 was released and people lost their minds over it. I mean, it was national news. With the successful launch of Halo 2, Bungie was on a pedestal and people couldn't wait to see what would come next. 2007 finally rolled around, and if you thought the hype for Halo 2 was big, Halo 3 was even bigger. The multiplayer, the
Halo
campaign,
better,
and the community were on a whole new level.
No!
It was the pinnacle of gaming. So Bungie did it. They had set out to create some of the best games of our era and were ready to throw in the towel after Halo 3. The studio had achieved what it set out to do. They were ready to move on.
It was really important to us to end on a high note with Halo 3.
But of course, Microsoft couldn't let that happen. Halo was the golden goose, and they weren't done with it. So Bungie was asked to create one more Halo game before leaving Microsoft, and that game was Halo Reach.
They need a Halo.
Halo Reach was a beautiful game. The campaign was emotional, and the Forge was unreal.
Yeah, the Forge was amazing. I don't think that many people utilized it or used it much, which is fine. And I will say, from an emotional story, like even just the trailer, if you can go and watch the trailer at the end after this video, it felt way different. And if you watch the trailer knowing that this was supposed to be kind of like the last game, and it probably was the last game that a lot of the actual OG Halo developers worked on, you could tell it felt like a somber moment to them. It felt like they were the end of an era. It felt like something, they were leaving something behind, not necessarily in a negative way, but in a time moves on way. So if you watch that trailer, Remember Reach, knowing this, it hits a little bit different.
That said, I don't think Halo Reach was as good as Halo 3. Right? Don't get me wrong. I think it's a phenomenal game.
I think that's
it
totally
made
fair.
$200 million on its launch day. To many, it was peak Halo. However, for me, I believe Halo Reach wasn't made with as much passion as the previous Halos because the team had already told the Halo story they wanted to tell. Okay. Players were pretty sad when Bungie moved on from Halo, but excited to see what they would do next. And as we watched Bungie give its farewell, Microsoft, behind the scenes, handed the Halo mantle to a new studio, 343.
Is that the Halo
Well,
TV
only a
show?
year had passed since Reach, and it was announced that Halo 4 would be coming out in 2012. At the time, most of us didn't think about Halo 4 being made by another developer as being too big of a deal. We were just excited for more Halo. And on launch day, the hype clearly had a big impact on Halo 4 because it made $220 million. Players were eager to continue the story of Master Chief, but something was different. The gameplay was different. It just felt off. I mean, it looked like Halo, but it didn't
Halo
feel like
1.5.
Halo. And only after a few months in, players started dropping like flies, flocking back to Halo 3 and Reach. At the time, players thought that maybe it was just a fluke. 343 was learning the ropes.
I don't think so. I don't think people thought it was a fluke. I think, and maybe he just has a different opinion than me, but I thought people were genuinely skeptical, but like more skeptical than he was saying of the game in the first place of Halo 4. But after people actually got a chance to play it for a little while, the sort of worst fears were confirmed, as they say. I don't think very many people saw it as a fluke. I mean, think about how volatile and angry the gaming community is, just in general. And so the idea that they had something they could actually point to, people were genuinely pissed at this. Like,
got caught up in that Call of Duty hype. Halo 5 will be different. 343 learned their lesson. Halo 5 rolls around and it makes $400 million in its first 24 hours. So people loved it, right? Nope. No co-op campaign, overly aggressive and competitive multiplayer, and no content at launch. How can a company screw up so many things that their predecessors, Bungie, had already paved the path for? Players at this point just hoped 343 was going to learn from their mistake. They would listen to the community this time and release a game that players really want. Bonnie Ross said 343 will do better and promised there will be a co-op campaign this time. The next Halo will be different.
And I would say for any FPS going out forward, we will always have split screen in going forward.
Well, that wasn't included in launch, and they said it was coming.
Wasn't that
and
not
now,
even in the most recent
inexplicably,
Halo?
it has been canceled.
I forget.
Split
Maybe it
screen
was.
co-op has been canceled in Halo Infinite.
We have had to make the difficult decision not to ship campaign split screen co-op and take the resources that we would use on that and go after this list and all these other things that we're going to talk about.
Everybody cares
in just
about
a
all
sec.
of these.
How can a company with 6 years of development, $500 million, make a game with such little content, so many bugs, a garbage progression system, and just be okay to release it? How can 343 screw up this much? It just doesn't make sense. We've heard many answers from the community. 343 didn't earn it. 343 doesn't like Halo. 343 is trying to turn a party game into a competitive game. All valid answers. But you would think that if 343 really cared, they would figure out how to make a good Halo
earn
game.
it or not, like, they are the ones handed, we use the Halo term, the mantle of responsibility on this one. Like, there's going to be some guys who I think came from Bungie and like continue to work at 343, or continue to work on Halo via 343. But at the end of the day, you're never going to satisfy anybody when you have this big of a community. You're never going to make everyone happy, number one. And number two, they are expected to hit a certain level, and it's just understandably to some degree because it is the Halo name, the Halo franchise. But the original Halo at this point had come out almost 2 decades ago, maybe like 15 years ago. I think some leeway has to be given to, like, how do you bring Halo into the future? And they might miss more than they hit, frankly, and that sucks. But like playing Combat Evolved, the literal original Halo Combat Evolved today isn't bad, but they can't just put that out with shinier graphics, better lighting, and a couple new weapons, right? They can't do that. So I'm not sitting here defending the most recent or the most couple recent Halo releases, but they at least went for something and they just horribly failed at the execution. So that's sort of the counterbalance to like, I mean, we're now like more than halfway through the video. So I don't know if he's going to bring up, I assume he will, a couple like indie releases to show how they differ. But number one, the size and scope of AAA games are vastly different. And again, this isn't to defend and by any means. There needs to be a wholesale like turnover, especially at the top of a lot of these companies, but the scopes are different, and most of these indie games are only at this point like 2 to 3 years old. They're not system selling, decade spanning TV show launching IPs. Maybe they will be at some point. Like maybe Five Nights at Freddy's is the kind of closer example, and one that's been around for a while. And they're making, I think, a TV show or a movie about it also. So it's kind of in that realm, but like the gameplay is vastly different. So in any event, some credit where it's due is, I guess, ultimately what I'm trying to say.
However, the main reason why 343 just can't make a good Halo game is because something about the company is fundamentally broken. Let's compare 343 to Bungie. So Bungie's entire company culture revolved around making the best game possible. This drove them to make Halo.
And you should probably specify old Bungie, because a lot of people have problems with Destiny.
Halo bigger and better each release. 343's focus, on the other hand, revolves around money and how they can make more of it. Every Halo game they release has less content and has gotten worse.
Even indie games don't have problems with creating a progression system, yet multiverses and Splitgate just fucking blow Halo Infinite out of the water.
Yeah.
You don't even have a progression system.
It's easy to see the difference in quality between these two studios, but it's not as easy to see why there's a difference. And this is why 343 doesn't have the capacity to make a good game. The leaders of the company don't put quality of the game first. They put money first. And this culture of money first thinking trickles down to everyone.
And so this is one thing to kind of understand about corporate America or corporate anywhere, is that everyone lower on the totem pole is sort of pushed out into the open as much as possible to absorb as much flack as possible. So at the bottom, you have customer service reps who are either answering tickets or the sort of head of community involvement, whatever the hell they want to call it. And that person is there to be a lightning rod for the next rung up, some like mid-level manager shithead or whatever. And then that person is a lightning rod for the next person. And then ultimately you get to the CEO, right? But the CEO isn't actually the head of the company. CEO is a representative there to do one thing and one thing only, and that's called maximize shareholder value. So the board of directors is ultimately the head of any company, and that goes for literally any public company. Now, in some cases, the company might have a majority ownership, i.e. 51+%, by one or two individuals or a single entity that has a single goal, and so they can enforce their will because they have a literal majority. But most of the time, that's not the case. And most of the time, even if it is, the collective majority of the board cares about one thing only, and that's making money. And the second the CEO steps out of line and puts product ahead of profit, they will get fired. And so, yeah, you can say they should do that, and maybe you're right. And maybe it would be nice if these guys who are making literally millions of dollars a year have a target of like, okay, I've put 10 mil in the bank. I can afford to do the right thing and get fired for it. Unfortunately, that's not usually what happens. But even if they did, again, they would be replaced by somebody who gets it. And by gets it, I mean they put shareholder value above everything else. So you might get a few instances, but those of somebody putting gameplay, putting customers first, whatever you want to call it. But those instances and those individuals would be quickly replaced by the board with somebody who is in lockstep with the idea that money comes first and everything comes second. That's just the way it is. And that's why if you are a game developer or really any company owner, any business owner, you have to be very wary of taking public money, of going public, of having an IPO, because once that happens, you no longer have control over something that you might have spent 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, 30 years building. instantaneously, by accepting public money, by accepting outside investment, you can lose control of the overall direction of your company. And so again, we can talk shit, and it's somewhat deserved, because at the end of the day, they're making millions of dollars. And so you're gonna eat some shit from the community if what you're doing is bad. But like, the real crux of it comes down to the board of directors and the owners of these companies, these institutional investors or wealthy families or whatever, who will replace anybody that gets in the way of them making more money.
Even if you are a 343 developer that just loves Halo, any reward as an employee only comes when your work is furthering the goal of making more money, not the best game.
Yes. All the details are... I love it. This is the first time?
Oh, so yeah. You're really hoping it doesn't crash, right?
Just seeing that explosion of like a very clear mobile game influenced loot box, whatever the fuck, and then seeing Halo stuff makes me a little bit sick.
That's fantastic.
My stomach, honestly.
Now, I haven't answered a very important question. Why wouldn't 343 prioritize making the best game? Won't that make you more money as a company? At first glance, this seems obvious. Make a good game, you'll make money.
It's
right?
a risk,
well,
though.
Kind of. If you make a great game and you have a marketing budget, then sure, you're bound to sell copies. But large AAA companies discovered a way to make more money than ever before without necessarily making a great game. Live service games. You may have noticed that an increasing number of AAA games launched live service games with battle passes and content roadmaps. Why? They make a lot more money after launch day thanks to microtransactions.
Yeah.
You no longer just make money
it's no
when
longer
people
about the sale weekend or this first sale week in revenue. That used to be the main thing in gaming. Like when I was in the finance industry, that's what I used to see a lot. Finance reporters and, like stock market people would be like, GTA made, like $500 million or $1 billion on release. And it was also the annual COD releases, $500 million, 600 million, 750, up to $1 billion in the first 3 days. And that was every year they were releasing a game, and they were constantly just hitting higher and higher weekends. That has sort of shifted away from a lifetime value, where that not only can continue not just having to worry about that opening weekend and stressing and pulling their hair out to make that first 3 days or the first 7 days as high in sales as possible. They can shift that to something that's more of, yes, opening day is still highly important, opening weekend highly important, but we can also strip out the cost of game development in a literal sense of underdeveloping a game, and then patch it in every 2 months with a season pass, a battle pass, whatever you want to call it, patch in that content. And we not only make more money throughout the life cycle of the game, but for at least a time, gamers didn't even notice. And even when they did notice, people still buy it. So that's where we are now.
Which is your game. It's not one and done. You can make money now during its entire lifespan. The developer is inclined to continue supporting the game and its community long after launch. But it doesn't help that 99 out of 100 live service games coming out these days are only that way because executives are rushing out unfinished products, and most of these games just end up in the AAA graveyard next to Anthem. Still, there are a few games that have found long-term success with this model. League of Legends, World of Warcraft, Destiny 2, but I would argue that the success of these live service games have hindered the creation of sequels long overdue. It's been 20 years since Warcraft 3 came out. 20.
Nobody makes art. Like, do people even make RTSs? And I get what he's saying, and I agree. And I loved Warcraft 2 and 3. I played a little bit of 1, but mainly 2 and 3 when I was much younger. I don't think that there's a huge market. I mean, even StarCraft, which is just held up by basically the Korean market, or at least the East Asia market, it just doesn't make that much money for a big studio anymore. So, I mean, maybe an indie studio could kind of prove that the RTS market still exists in a way that it used to, but certain genres just kind of either come and go, or maybe it's more cyclical. Like maybe we will see a reemergence of RTS games. Maybe there's some kind of format or mode that's going to bring it back. That's not just harvest resources, build, upgrade, that sort of game loop. But if there was money in it, I mean, if people wanted to play it, they would build it. They would just turn it into a live service zombie, into a Frankenstein. They would do race packs They would do cosmetics for your little like soldiers or workers, harvesters, whatever. Like they will turn this into a live service in record time. I just don't think that there's players to warrant it for some giant budget from Activision, for example. Activision Blizzard.
Years. Where in the world is Warcraft 4? The reason Blizzard hasn't made it yet, despite Warcraft 3 being so successful, is because they haven't figured out how to make it a live service.
I guess this is
so
why
here
I
we sit
disagree with
in
the guy.
2022, having watched our favorite IPs disappear or just be bastardized by the companies we once revered. What do we do now? For every bad AAA game released, 10 great indie games are released simultaneously. I mean, why is the Untitled Goose Game the best stealth game I've ever played?
My boo! Hey!
This is a really
I'll just take this.
Why is Hollow Knight with its
Dude, Donkey's a fucking legend. I still remember him singing Rake in the Lake. Like that was like only 30 seconds of that video probably, and that was a decade ago.
The atmosphere and tight gameplay, the best Metroidvania. And why is a roguelite indie game about escaping hell over and over sound simple, but play just so perfectly? It's not because these indie developers are the most talented or have oodles of cash on hand. It's because they did one thing and one thing only. They followed the fun. That game about escaping hell over and over is the breakout phenomenon Hades. And I can't think of a game or a game studio more focused than them on following the fun. Why? Because Supergiant Games spent 2 years with Hades in early access, making sure every detail of the game was what the community wanted. 2 years. I know you hear early access and like live service, you imagine all the train wrecks over the years. But Hades and Supergiant did it right. Hades creative director Greg Kasavin said this about its 2-year early access. With Hades, we identified that we wanted to make an early access game first and foremost to see what we could build in partnership with our community.
I wonder if people would give a AAA industry... How do I phrase this? I wonder if people would give the AAA industry the benefit of allowing them to have 2 years of an EA. Like, I think an indie studio can and should be able to... I don't want to say get away with this. It seems... that's not what I'm trying to say. I think they would let an indie studio do this as part of their... game development process. I think a AAA industry or a AAA studio would get a never-ending tsunami of shit for spending 2 years in early access. Now, a way they could counter this is, this game upon release will cost $60 or probably now $70. But if you buy it in early access, it's maybe $20 or $30 or something like that. But to be fair, the counterpoint is probably like, would execs allow them to do that? Would the gaming execs allow the studio or developers to push out a game in early access for half price, and then upon release, they're not spending any more, at least for the base game? And maybe they would, honestly, but we've seen them already do this, right? Cyberpunk came out in an early access game state, truly, like an alpha, not even a beta. Came out in an alpha at best, and it was full price. Sadly, and it hurts my heart to say this, Kerbal Space Program 2, I fucking love Kerbal Space Program, but even though it's tagged as early access, it still costs $50 for the game, and it barely works with what's in the game is probably less than half of what the original game was, and it's probably somewhere between a fifth and a quarter at best of what is promised for Kerbal Space Program 2. What they have said will be in the game. And this is a game that was supposed to be released in 2019, I think. And it was subsequently pushed back year after year after year until finally coming out early this year. And yes, it's early access, but this is why you have trepidation as a customer at this point, if you're old enough to have seen a few of these, because you're like, they're not charging $20 for their early access game and spending 2 years growing and building a partnership with our community like the Hades developers did. They're going to release it for at or near full price and force you to basically be the public QA testers for their dog shit fucking game.
So the plan was to do early access from the get-go. Supergiant wanted Hades to be in the hands of the community, not for the quick buck like these other games, but because Supergiant wanted to build a fun game that the community would love. This culture, this mentality of following the fun is what sets apart Supergiant Games and a variety of other indie studios from AAA. Us gamers really only want one thing: to play a fun game alone or with our buddies. And indie studios really understand this concept because they're gamers too. Indie studios these days are reminiscent of Tomohiro or the original Bungie team. Solo or small team developers who are focused on building something they or their community actually want to play. We seem to have come full circle. Yes, new tools have made it easier than ever to make games, and yes, Steam has made publishing games incredibly simple. But that's not the main reason we are entering the golden age of indie.
It's absolutely not, because anybody who remembers Steam Greenlight remembers that that can be an absolute and will be an absolute shit show.
Games. If there was the 100th Minecraft copycat, would be rolling in money right now. The reason why indie studios are dominating the video game industry is because indie studios have what AAA studios don't have: the right culture and a desire to follow the fun.
No matter what, that's who Bungie is.
This is a great video. As always, I'll put a link to it in the description down below. I appreciate the depth that he went into for Halo and Bungie in particular. I also appreciate the parallels he drew from the Hades team. I actually would have liked to see a little bit more in depth from them on the indie side, because this is sort of a compare and contrast indie games AAA. So a little bit more on perhaps like the indie side and why it's blooming and superior, whatever you want to call it. So, but again, he did talk about Hades and such. I think what I said in the beginning stands. People who are passionate make better products. It really doesn't matter what it is. It could be woodworking, it could be video games. It's just a fact. Large companies who are beholden to a board of directors because they went public, they took public money, will never ever be able to create the same level of masterpiece that a non-public company can, simply because the CEO and the top leadership is there to do one thing and one thing only, and that is maximize shareholder value. Now, don't despair too much, because you can have large companies that aren't public. The public aspect tends to come when original creators of the company want to sell or cash out, and that is usually the best and biggest way to do it. But you can still have large companies with hundreds of employees who are private. It is still absolutely possible. So one thing that we might be able to be hopeful for here as gamers is these indie studios, which we've seen crop up in the last 5 to 10 years, will over time, some of them at least, have people who are interested in creating a company. Some of them just want to be individual creators. They just want to be individual producers of video games, and there's nothing wrong with that. Some might want to have a sort of bigger vision for what they want, and they want to create an actual gaming company. And so those people are now still in the early stages of their company, but as they grow, as their games come out and do well, they will take a lion's share of that money and reinvest it into growing the company to be able to do larger projects, hire employees. And so with that, we will hopefully see a golden age of video gaming here in the late 2020s. I would love to say now, but realistically, late 2020s, maybe early 2030s, because those companies have started to mature in 100, 200, 300 person companies as they grow over 10 to 15 years. So real quick, I wanted to check out maybe some of the comments here. AAA industry killed itself. Indie games just, I think this is true for a lot of things. It could be true for politics, it could be true for business. So many times it's not so much somebody winning as it is the other guy losing. Hades, Hollow Knight, Undertale, Celeste, Stardew Valley. Yeah, some of the greatest games I've ever played. I'm so glad that the indie developers are able to be successful and show the AAA overlords how it's done. Yeah. For me, it's not about switching from AAA to indie. It's about quitting an addiction. And that's fair. Yeah, that's fair. You should not be gaming at the cost of literally everything else in your life, even though we've all probably been there. That'll be it for this video. Thanks so much. If you liked it, please go ahead and subscribe. And if you wouldn't mind going ahead and going to the description, clicking on the original video, and even just letting it play for a little while. I love doing reactions. I love seeing other people's takes, but I do want to support as much as possible. So even if it's just letting the video run for a minute or two, it'll add a view to the original video. So that's it for me. Thanks so much. Have a good one.